Joining me now is Garrett Martin. He's with the School of International Service at the American University here in Washington, D.C. Garrett, the Munich Security Conference had a report that says the Trump administration displays, quote, unquote, irritating enthusiasm for strongmen across the globe and disdain for international institutions and agreements. Do we see a transatlantic rift or divide, if anything?
I would definitely agree that this is a challenging period for the transatlantic partnership, and arguably the most difficult period since maybe 2002, 2003, when you had the big divide over the Iraq War. We're seeing a divide and a rift over a variety of subjects. That includes, of course, over trade, also over the Iran nuclear deal, and we've seen that also over NATO. So there's certainly the atmospherics are not good in the transatlantic partnership, and the Munich Security Conference essentially reflected that really in the open.
But in what ways do you think that divide is on display over this conference? Do you think in any ways the leaders try to bridge this divide maybe? Or is this conference telling us that the divide is getting worse?
Well, in some respects, at least publicly, it doesn't seem to be getting any better. I mean, the Munich Security Conference is always famous for not only the public speeches, but it's also a meeting group, a gathering for many leaders where they can have these informal, more secretive talks. So it's hard to say what really happens completely on the sidelines. But at least the public declarations should not make us very reassured. There doesn't seem to be any great will to patch things up and to try and address the points of differences. I mean, we saw that, for instance, over the question of Iran and how Vice President Mike Pence criticized the major European allies.
There are many pessimists about the so-called US-led post-World War II liberal order. With NATO as a key ally. Do you think this is just a temporary setback with Trump being president, or do we see a more perennial falling apart between US and its NATO allies?
Well, you have to be careful. I think there are still, despite the bad atmospherics at the higher level, there is still a pretty solid foundation to the transatlantic partnership on a day-to-day basis and in a variety of subjects. So I think the foundations are still good, but we're seeing on a certain number of subjects that these disputes have become more in the open and are in some respects more virulent. That being said, I think for NATO, for instance, the core of the disagreement over defense spending is something that every presidential administration, every American president has criticized Europeans for not spending more. So I think we have to keep some degree of perspective here in terms of the intensity of the challenges. But it is a difficult time.
Let's talk about some specific issues. The Iran nuclear deal. German Chancellor Angela Merkel made no secret about her disdain for America's intention to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. Where do you think the European countries and the US are headed regarding the Iran issue?
Well, I think it's a challenge because when President Trump decided to withdraw from the JCPOA, aka the nuclear deal in May, he didn't only withdraw, he also made it very difficult for the remaining participants, so the three main European players, the UK, France, Germany, along with Russia and China, made it very difficult with the reimposition of sanctions to be able to keep the deal going. Essentially, the deal was a quid pro quo where, in exchange for removing sanctions, Iran would comply with a certain number of measures. The risk here is that the United States has given a very difficult choice to the European firms. Either you trade with the American market or you trade with the Iranian market, but you cannot choose. You can't have both. You must make a choice. So I think the big risk here is the Europeans have tried to come up with a special purpose vehicle to allow their firms to trade with Iran, but it may not be enough. And Iran is already showing signs that it wants the Europeans to step up. So the biggest risk is that the Iran nuclear deal might die through 1,000 cuts. It will be a slow death over a period of time.
Another interesting player, coming into this US-EU relationship is China. The British government today actually just issued a statement that says the British government has concluded that the Huawei China telecommunication network is a manageable risk to its 5G network. It may not follow the US warning to ban Huawei's 5G operations in the UK. So where do you think how do you look at the dynamics between EU, US, and China relationship?
Well, the way I see it is that the EU and European nations more at large are finding themselves between a rock and a hard place. They're facing pressure from the United States, as you mentioned, to try and ban Huawei for the development of the 5G networks. And of course, China is arguing that that's not a fair policy and that the United States is just doing this out of sort of competition and there's no real merit to that position. So I think the challenge for the European nations is to see, can they come up with a common united position? So that's going to be the real, I think, challenge. I think a lot of the smaller nations in Europe are waiting to see what Germany does. And I think Germany still seems to be mulling whether it will follow the American position or it will take a more modest position, or if it will look into do further research to see if Huawei does pose a security threat or not. I think the UK may also be a bit of an exception because it is leaving the EU soon, and it is also thinking of its future trading policy and future trading partnership with China.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Garrett Martin with American University, thanks so much for your insight.
My pleasure.